Hi, happy Sunday school / Monday school. It's Kathy, and we are on week 9. It's been so fast. Week 9 of the study of David. And we are going to study today 2 Samuel chapter 13 through 17. It's not a happy time for David. It's not a happy time for his family. And really, while studying this week, my heart broke in a couple of different ways. And I really was overcome with a lot of emotions. So we're going to run through it. Where we picked up is right after David and Bathsheba, where he orders Uriah to be killed, and Nathan has to bring him a parable of the ewe, Ewe, and you, You, before David realizes or admits his sin and repents. And because of that, just a reminder that God forgave him because God is gracious, but he has to temper his justice with mercy. Um, he doesn't have to. He tempers his justice with mercy. So even though he forgave him, there's always some kind of cost or consequence for our sin. In the flesh, we always have to figure that out. Sometimes we become sick because of our sin. Like if you're smoking for 50 years, you're going to be sick. Sometimes it's an emotional toll. Sometimes it's on relationships. But sin is good for a season, it says. It's pleasurable for a season, but consequences last sometimes a lifetime. And in David's case, his lifetime and generations later. So here, just to backtrack in 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 8 through 15, God delivers his judgment. And his judgment has 4 main parts to it. He says, first, remember that what I gave you was everything. I gave you your kingdom. I called you out of a sheepfold. But you have despised my word. And because of that, because of the injustice, I have to pass judgment. And it's fourfold. Number 1, he says, the sword will not depart from your house. Violence is going to come, and violence is going to set up a home there. Number 2, he said, I will raise evil from within your own household. Number 3, your private sin will have public consequences or public humiliation. And then the 4th judgment we've already seen, and that was that his firstborn with Bathsheba dies. Even after he fasts and he prays, he loses his firstborn. So today we pick up right after that, shortly after that, and we see that the acorn doesn't fall far from the tree, that the sin of the father is repeated by one of his sons. And it's the judgment is the evil will rise from your own household. And that's what we see happening in 2 Samuel chapter 13, verses 1 through 14. It is the story of the rape of Tamar. And this is where it just was angry and heartbroken for this woman. But we need to dig in. We need to see what can we take away from this. So Amnon was David's firstborn. He is prince heir to the throne. Now at this time, it wasn't automatically assumed that the firstborn would take the throne, but most of the time that's how it happened. And his name means trustworthy or faithful. He does not live up to his name. And he follows in his father's footsteps. He follows in his father's foolishness. He has a half-sister named Tamar, who is Absalom's full sister. So they do not share a mother, but they share David as their father. And then we have a third person we need to know, and his name is Jonabad. Bad to the bone, Jonabad. That's kind of where I remember him. He's described as a very shrewd man, and in this case, shrewd doesn't mean that he's cheap. Shrewd means that he is cold and malicious and mischievous. He is spinning some webs. So here it is. Amnon develops this lust, this burning lust for his half-sister. And he knows that he's not to have her. He knows all about incest. He knows all about adultery. He just kind of witnessed his father go through it. Although I'm honest with you, I don't know if David actually sat down with his grown children and repented before them. And we're going to get to why I think that's important. So Jonadab says, well, then lay with her. Okay, first of all, I've said this before. You need to watch the people you surround yourself with when it comes to how they give you counsel. Jonadab comes back with, oh, I got a great plan. Why don't you go home, lay in your room, fake a sickness, and request Tamar to bring you some food. They actually made the bread at the table side. I don't know. So he does. He fakes a sickness. He requests for Tamar to come in, make him some bread. She does. He refuses to eat it until everybody leaves. He sends away all of his servants, and then he sets his desire to violate her against her will. It is a rape. Tamar's pleas with her brother, just desperate. It is in verse 12 and 13. She wants to give him all of the reasons, logically, emotionally, why this is not a good idea. She's just pleading for him to not violate her. She is a princess. She is a virgin. And if you know anything about biblical times, to be deflowered, so to speak, brings disgrace onto you, brings disgrace onto your family. You're defiled to the point where you're not going to get married. So she pleads with him in verse 12. She answered him, no, my brother, do not violate me, for such a thing is not done in Israel. Do not do this disgraceful thing. As for me, where could I get rid of my reproach? And as for you, you will be like one of the fools in Israel. Now therefore, please speak to the king, for he will not withhold me from you. 14. However, he would not listen to her, and since he was stronger than her, he violated her and lay with her. She says, number one, this violates God's law, and you know that. It's out of Leviticus 18:11. This is a violation of God's law, and it's punishable by death. Number two, she reminds him that it is disgraceful. It's not just disgraceful for him and her, but because they are royalty, it's a disgrace to her family, including David, to the nation. And then she said it would bring reproach on her. That's not just disgrace. Reproach is like a huge black blot that cannot be removed. It's more than people talking about you. It's more than sullying her reputation. She would be reprehensible and unclean for the rest of her life. She said you would look like the fools of Israel. You are a prince, and you'd be seen as a wicked fool among all your people. You could potentially take the crown. Would you want that as your reputation for the people that you are lording over? And then the last part of this desperate is, if you go to the king, if you go to David, and you tell him that you want to lie with me, the desperation says, maybe David would allow you to. Maybe you could marry me. It's a violation of all kinds of Mosaic laws. Leviticus 18:9, 11, and verse 20 and 17. But she's desperate. If she can get him even to go talk to David, she can escape. But he doesn't. So there is the rape. Thank God it doesn't go into any kind of detail. And he doesn't, because it says some things are unspeakable. When you talk about some sins that are unspeakable, we're not dwelling on the details. It happened. It was violent. It was vile. Moving on. He overpowers her in 14. And then in verse 15, his immediate reaction is, he hated her with a very great hatred. For the hatred with which he hated her was greater than the love for which he had loved her. And Amnon said, get up and go away. She says to him in 16, no, because this wrong of sending me away is even worse than the rape. It's even worse than what you've done to me. If she is sent away, it shows that she has some kind of that she was a participant. It shows that she's defiled. It shows that she has shame. Um, why does he hate her immediately? I don't know if he's challenged by his sin or if it was just, I'm done with you. He got what he wanted, and then perhaps he sent her away because of his own guilt, his lust, his disgust, or to shame her, or because he couldn't deal with his own sin. She makes that appeal that if she is sent away, she's seen as guilty. He then calls his servant as a witness to say, send her away. So it's not going to be a her word and his word. He said, she said. He's going to get a witness to go on his side. So if it ever comes up before the king, if it ever comes up before the people, he can say it was her fault. Amnon. Tamar leaves and shows us just her horrible amount of shame that she carries with her. In verse 18 and 19 said she had on a long sleeve garment, which was typical of the princesses. Long sleeve because of modesty. It was very ornate because she's royalty. It was beautiful. It was a beautiful garment. And it was on her, and she put her hand and she ripped the sleeves. And then after she had left, she puts ashes on her hand, which is a sign of mourning. She's grieving for what she lost, not just for her virginity, her potential family, her potential future. If she is turned out of the king's house, she is considered unclean. She gets nothing. She's treated as a woman that is defiled. And then she puts her hand over her head and she goes away weeping. It's a very sad, makes me very angry to read this. But it doesn't surprise me. It doesn't surprise me because David never, and this is what I think, this is my opinion. It's not Bible. David repented and says, I have sinned against you, God. I've sinned against you, God. But he doesn't come clean from what I see in the Bible and from what I've seen in scholars to actually go to his family. When we sin, we don't sin in a vacuum. Our consequences are long-reaching. We see this. Had he had an absolute conversation with his adult children, especially his male children, about the dangers of lust, about the dangers of immorality, about his own sin and failure, I think we might not have had this happen. But it is the fulfillment of judgment. Evil will rise from your household. Now, she goes away and she comes to Absalom, her brother, first. And in verse 20, he says to her, it doesn't get better for her. Absalom, her brother, said to her, has Amnon, your brother, been with you? By now keep silent, my sister. He's your brother, and don't take this matter to heart. So Tamar remained and was desolate in her brother Absalom's house. He sweeps it under the carpet. He says, don't say anything. He's your brother. She goes away desolate. She lives in his house, but she's not in his house. It could have been a trauma that kind of stayed with her. It could have been an isolation. But it doesn't say that she became part of his household. She's just in a room somewhere. Absalom minimized the sin, but we find out that he stewed in his anger over it for 2 years. In verse 21, we know David finds out. And when David, the king, heard all of these matters, he was very angry. Okay, there should be more to that, right? He was very angry and he went to his son. He was very angry and he went to demand justice. He was very angry and he went to counsel his daughter. No, he was just very angry. Period. He did nothing. He does not take up his robe as a father, as a king. He just gets angry and does nothing. My thought, he doesn't want to call out his son's sin because of his own hypocrisy. A lot of times, the enemy is very good at silencing us because he reminds us of our own sin and he puts us in shame. We do not have the right to wallow in our sin, hide our sin, and use it as a crutch as to not call out injustice everywhere else. That's an enemy just putting us back in bondage. And because he refuses to deal with it for 2 years, Absalom goes into this whole stewing thing. And 2 years later, he seeks revenge against his brother. Absalom has this whole plan. There's always a plan with these boys. He invites David to come to a sheep shearing feast, knowing that David won't come. And so he says, well, send Amnon, your prince heir, to represent the crown. Amnon goes because, of course, it appeals to his pride and his ego. And in the whole situation, Absalom has this plan to just get him drunk, take away his defenses, and then kill him. Absalom does not kill him. In verse 29, it says, the servants of Absalom did to Amnon just as Absalom had commanded. And then all the king's sons rose and mounted the mule and fled away. He invited all the sons. All the sons were there. It was a big feast. And once they saw him kill Amnon, or have him killed, they all fled in fear. Maybe he was just going to wipe out the house. Violence is coming. And the second thing is it's coming from within his own household, right? That's the second part of judgment. So it's premeditated murder. That's what it is. Jonadab, who's the one that started this whole idea with Tamar, comes back and announces to David that Amnon is dead, but the rest of the sons are not. So he is trying to get into David's good graces now because Amnon is dead, and he was Amnon's advisor. And he brings this news in hope that David would promote him or something. We don't know what David does. Usually when people do that, David has them killed, but this one he didn't. So David banishes Absalom. He refuses to deal with Absalom and demand justice. It says in verses 36 through 39, Absalom fled. 37. Absalom fled and went to Jeshar, and David mourned for his son every day. I find a little bit too little, too late that David is mourning for Absalom. It doesn't say he mourned for Amnon, and he certainly isn't mourning for Tamar because he hasn't gone to her in 2 years. And it says in 39 that he was comforted about Amnon because Amnon was dead. He felt that justice was served. So he sends him away. And he's away for 3 years. He doesn't send him back from banishment for 3 years. And Joab, who we've seen before, Joab's a murderer of Abner. He's one of the mighty men. He gives David some really crappy counsel. Joab comes back with a parable. He's mirroring Nathan. Beware of people who want to bring you, thus saith the Lord, who are not close to the Lord. Joab is not close to the Lord. He's a murderer. He's unrepentant. But he's going to come up with this story and pose it as a parable to get David to bring back his son. I just want to pause here and say, David is disabled in his own sin. And I've already said that, but Ephesians 4:26 says, be angry and sin not. It does not mean be angry and do nothing. David had plenty of opportunities in the 5 years since his daughter's rape to deal with it, but he does nothing. We have a mandate to speak for the people who have no voice. And I will put up as my tag what this is. It's from the book of Proverbs where it says, I need to speak for those who have no voice. I need to put righteousness where there is injustice. And I'll tag you in that at the end. That's an aside. It's fascinating to do a study on speaking for those who are oppressed, speaking for victims, speaking for those who have no voice, and really seeking justice. He doesn't do any of that. So in 2 Samuel 14, we get reconciliation, sort of. Verse 1 through 20, 3 years after he leaves, and Joab comes up with this parable, like Nathan's parable. He sends for a woman who lives about 10 miles away from Tekoa to tell this story about a brother killing a brother, that the death penalty was invoked, and that if both of them are dead, she would be desolate as a widow. She would be desolate without her boys, and she would be penniless. It would leave her without family, without hope, and without continuing her family line. So in 14:14, she says, "For we will surely die, and we will surely die, and like water spilled on the ground, which cannot be gathered up again. Yet God does not take away life, but plans ways so the banished one will not be cast away." Sin, once it's delivered, as it says here, like water spilled on the ground, cannot be gathered up again. Second part of that is a promise of the Lord, but God does not take away life, but plans ways so the banished one will be not cast from him. He has a way of tempering justice with mercy. So she's calling for mercy. David, the last parable, he's like, yeah, I need 4 times judgment. He's wiser this time. And he said, who put you up to this? And she admits that it is Joab. And she admits that he's the one that comes up to tell the story. David does bring Absalom back in verse 21 through 33. He is recalled but not restored. There is no reconciliation here. He is recalled but not restored. Relationships need to be reconciled and restored. He did it so it would look good. But really there is no conversation. Joab goes in verse 21 to 23 to get Absalom. He comes back. He expects to go to the king, and the king says, send him to his house. He is in his house for 2 more years. He has not come to his father for 2 more years. He's not on house arrest. He goes all kinds of places, but he doesn't have an audience with David for 2 years. Joab continues to appeal. Absalom shows his desperation, and he finally gets to the king. He falls before the king prostrate, and the king gives him a ceremonial kiss. That's it. There is no reconciliation. I think that's another thing we see about David. He doesn't try to reconcile, and he doesn't try to fix what happened with Amnon and Tamar. He doesn't try to fix what happened with his son, and that's going to come back to challenge him over and over again. Because of this, Absalom burns. He burns with anger towards his father, and he unashes the beginning of a conspiracy. That conspiracy is going to go on for a couple chapters. Remember the judgment. Evil will rise up in your own household, and the sword will not depart. So he has this daily routine, Absalom, since he can't go, hang out with his father and his family, is he gets up all of his chariots, he puts on his best robe, he brings his men with him, and he goes and he shows up at the gate of the city every day for 4 years.
I don't got no Barbie.
Okay, we'll pause and we'll get him in a minute. She needs her Barbies. And what he does is he sets up a judgment stand where people come to him for advice. They want him to fix disputes. And he wins the people's heart by being a fair judge and showing all this pageantry and showing all this mercy. And he does that in verses 1 through 6 of chapter 15. And he does it over and over and over again. David has to know what's happening. But he keeps turning a blind eye to what's going on. And I have no idea why. So he does this for 4 years. And then he decides in verse 7, it's time for me to leave. And he moves to Hebron. Now, Hebron has some significance. First of all, it's where he's from. His mother was from Hebron. David married her when he was a king in Hebron of Judah, and that's his birthplace. But the other significance is that's where David started his kingdom in Judah. So he's going back to the roots, because he has a plan to start a kingdom. And then in verse 10 and 12 in chapter 15, he makes his move. Absalom sent spies throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, as soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet, then you shall say, Absalom is king in Hebron. He's declaring himself king. And 200 men went with Absalom from Jerusalem, who were invited and went innocently, and they did not know anything. And then he sends for David's counselors, and he's offering sacrifices, and he gets allegiance of all of these powerful people. David, in verse 13 through 37, he realizes this is not good, and he flees. He runs away. He does not confront. He flees. Now, might not be a bad idea, because he has got more favor, Absalom does now, than David does. And he's a little bit older. He's a little bit out of touch. But we see in verse 13 through 17, he has a bunch of friends who stay with Absalom in his stead. He leaves, he flees to save himself. He still has an army with him. But he leaves a few people behind. He leaves Ittai the Gittite and other Gentile allies surround him. A couple of chapters ago, he's given away all kinds of bounty to all these Gentiles around him. And that hospitality comes back, so he has a host when he runs away. He has allies that will harbor him and his men. There is, in verse 25, an exchange where two priests, Zadok and Abiathar, try to take up the ark and come with him. And he said, the ark belongs in Jerusalem. It doesn't belong with me. It belongs where God's people are. And because they go back, they can act kind of as spies for him as well. And it also shows that David is not putting God in a box. He's not saying the ark belongs to me, but it belongs to Israel. And then he leaves behind one of his counselors, who is Hushai, in verse 34. All of those people in the next few chapters will bring him news, will bring him comfort, or will speak on his behalf during the conspiracy. David's reaction in verse 30, he walks up the Mount of Olives, he covers his head, and he weeps. He mourns. I don't know what he's mourning for. Is he mourning for the loss of his family? Is he mourning for the betrayal of his son? Is he mourning because he turned a blind eye to sin? Is he mourning for his kingdom? I don't know what he's mourning for. Is he mourning because he's away from the Lord? But his reaction looks to be sincere. So he has some friends at the end of chapter 15. But we see he has way more enemies forming at the end of during 16. The first thing in verses 1 through 4, as he's traveling away, Ziba, who is the servant of Mephibosheth, comes to David and brings him all kinds of gifts. He brings him a fresh mule. He brings him some raisins. Everybody eats raisins and figs. Brings him some cakes and loaves for his people. Lots of good hospitality. David said, who sent this? And Ziba falsely says, oh, it was my idea. Mephibosheth is now siding with Absalom, and I wanted to bring this to you. Now, if you remember, Mephibosheth was restored 100-fold. He got all of his land back. He got all of his wealth back. He has a place at the table. Remember, he is the lame son of Jonathan. David showed kindness to him. They sat and ate together. But as soon as this man brings a false accusation, because he's desperate, he believes it. And he pulls all of that favor back away from Mephibosheth. He broke his covenant to Jonathan at that moment. The second enemy we find is verse 5 through 14 is Shimei. He is a relative of Saul's. And as David is passing by, he starts screaming curses and hatred, and he's just spewing things at him, and he's actually throwing things at him. It's very humiliating and disgraceful for David. But David shows restraint under public humiliation. Your private sin will have public humiliation, will have public consequences. He believes he gets what he deserves. I think he's wallowing in his own pity. He could have had him killed. He could have silenced him. He could have removed him. But he is so mournful of his own sin at this point, in my opinion, that he allows it to happen. The enemy always kicks you when you're down. He always takes the opportunity when you are at your lowest point to continue to bring false accusations, false people in your path. He's going to bring people who talk about you, who remind you of your sin, who want to humiliate you. That's what he's going to do. He's going to continue to put that in front of you. And David allows it. And then the biggest enemy here is going to be Absalom himself. Absalom, under the advice of his counsel, Ahithophel, gets this advice to take all of David's concubines. David leaves 10 concubines behind in Jerusalem. Your private sin will have public consequence, public humiliation. His son literally pitches a tent on top of his house, the same rooftop that David stood on when he saw Bathsheba and called for her, and he sets up a tent and he sleeps with all the concubines. It's a political move. Your private sin will have public consequences. And that's a fulfillment of chapter 12, verse 11 and 12. And it's fulfilled. Now we're going to stop there. My takeaway here is a couple of things. First of all, you need to have the voice for the injustice. You have to speak up when something is not right. If there is a crime, if there is a sin, if there is gossip happening that they're trying to pull you into. As a Christian, we are called to put a voice to the people who have no voice. The second takeaway here is once you have repented, do not allow the enemy to disarm you with your shame. If he can disarm you and you're not going to speak out, you will allow things to come into your life that have no business there, because you're too afraid to bring up your past in order to help somebody with their future. And then the third thing here is the idea that you do not have to live with the humiliation of your sin. With grace and mercy after forgiveness. David, when he was first repentant, he washed his face and he got to work. Don't let your sin disarm you. I think it's important for us to know that we have an accuser of the brethren who wants to constantly point his finger and say, but you did, but you did, but you did. And if he can use that as a tactic to silence you, to have you turn your eye to sin in your own life or other lives, then he's really putting you in a bondage. All right, I want to look for that Proverbs verse very quickly. All right. Proverbs 31, verses 8 through 9. I should have remembered that because I thought it was part of the Proverbs 31 woman. It's not. Proverbs 31, 8 and 9. Speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute. Speak up and judge fairly. Defend the rights of the poor and needy. David doesn't do that, not even for his own family. All right, I'm going to finish off with the Psalms that are here. There's a bunch of Psalms that are here, but Psalms 5 is the one that I would like to just read part of to you before we leave. So it's 3, 4, and 5. Let me see if I can get the rest of this down here. And then there's some Psalms later on also that are written. But let me get Psalms 5 for you. And then I will send you on your merry way. I'm reading from Pastor Vinny's Big Giant. It's literally called the Giant Print. It's like Super Giant Print Bible. I could have read it from across the room. David writes a bunch of Psalms when he is fleeing from Absalom, kind of reflecting on his own sin, kind of reflecting on his silence. 5 says, and I'm going to just run through it. Give ear to my words, O Lord, and consider my groaning. So he's crying out for the Lord to have mercy on him. In the morning, O Lord, this is 3, you will hear my voice, and in the morning you will order my prayer and watch. 4, for you are not a God who takes pleasure in wickedness. No evil dwells within you. The Lord, and this is 6, you destroy those who speak falsehood, and the Lord abhors a man of bloodshed and deceit. He's talking about Absalom. He's talking about Amnon. He could be talking about himself. But for me, 7, your abundant loving kindness, I will enter in your house. At your holy temple, I will bow in reverence for you. O Lord, lead me in your righteousness because of my foes. Make your way straight before me. Going all the way down to 11. In 10, he asks for justice, which is, to me, kind of interesting because he refuses to deal with justice. 11 and 12, but let all who take refuge in you be glad. Let them ever sing for joy, and may you shelter them, that those who love your name may exalt in you. For it is you who blesses the righteous man, O Lord. You surround him with favor as in a shield. All right, I know it's long, always is. Next week we'll continue on with Absalom and David. It gets even worse. Hope you have a great week. If you have any questions or feedback, let me know. And I will talk to you next week on week 10. Bye.